Welcome to Pages and Pods. In this episode, we'll explore the ancient Egyptian city of Heliopolis and review the mystical traditions which thrived in its religious traditions. Long before the pyramids towered over the desert, before Egypt unified under a single king, the site that would become Heliopolis was already sacred ground. Archaeology shows us that by the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, a settlement and ritual center stood on a raised ridge overlooking the eastern Nile Delta. This wasn't the dawn of humanity, it was the dawn of Egyptian civilization, when local cults formed around distinct sacred mounds. And later called Heliopolis, the rising sun struck the landscape in a dramatic, almost staged way, creating a natural focus for early solar reverence. What began as a modest ritual hub would grow into the intellectual and spiritual capital of pharaonic Egypt. To the Egyptians of later ages, this early sanctuary was more than a geographic site, it was a memory of origins. They believed the sacred mound at symbolized the Benben, the primordial hill that emerged from the waters of chaos at creation. The city's antiquity allowed later priests to say that the first time Zeptepi was eternally renewed here. Each sunrise reenacted the moment when Atum first appeared on the Benben, calling the world into being. Whether the place was founded in 3500 BCE or even earlier, its meaning reached back into mythic time, giving Heliopolis a status no other Egyptian city could claim, not just a settlement, but a cosmic birthplace where creation itself seemed closest to the earth. By the early Old Kingdom, Heliopolis was no longer just an ancient shrine, it had become a theological engine. Archaeological finds and Old Kingdom inscriptions showed that by the 4th dynasty, and certainly by the 5th dynasty, the priesthood of was shaping how kings understood their own divine rules. The earliest pyramid texts, carved inside the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs, reflect a fully developed solar theology that almost certainly originated in Heliopolis. In these texts, Atum rises on the primeval mound and brings forth the first generation of gods, the Ennead. Shu and Tefnut, Geb and Nut, and their children Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, while Ra emerges as the radiant form of Atum's creative power. Together they form a cosmic family tree that mirrored the hierarchy of Egypt itself. This wasn't just religion, it was the intellectual foundation of kingship. With this theology came a quiet revolution in power, as the Heliopolitan priesthood articulated the role of Atum as the self-created origin of the world. They also positioned themselves as interpreters of creation's blueprint. The pharaoh, once primarily the earthly manifestation of Horus, now had to situate himself within the solar lineage of Ra and Atum. This shift gave priests new authority. If they preserved the cosmic story, they preserved the king's legitimacy. Kingship, ritual, afterlife doctrine, all were reframed through the cosmology of Heliopolis. What looks like abstract myth was, in fact, practice, a redefinition of how Egypt understood government. As the solar theology matured, the idea that the pharaoh ruled through Ra became central to the state ideology. This meant the sun god, and by extension the priests who tended his cult, played a direct role in the legitimacy of royal power. Titles like Greatest of the Seers of Heliopolis, as they appeared in the Old Kingdom, as the elite offices held by influential figures close to the king. Scholars see these men as intellectuals, astronomers, ritual specialists, and political advisors. They did not rival the king, but their influence on royal ideology was unmistakable. In fact, they gave him legitimacy. Far from being mere caretakers of temple rites, the Heliopolis clergy were Egypt's earliest cosmologists. They observed the movement of the sun and the stars, aligned monuments to the cardinal axes, and developed a calendar that structured religious life across the kingdom. Their understanding of order, Mat, was not symbolic, it was astronomical, agricultural, and administrative. When the coffin text later declared, "What is in the sky is their knowledge, what is on earth is their dominion," they reflect the genuine integrity of priestly scholarship and statecraft. Ma'at was a blueprint for good life, to become one with the rhythm of the universe, and ultimately to become the embodiment of a ray of the sun itself. And these priests were not merely scholars, they were mystics of a very high order. Their spiritual practices were rooted in the ancient symbolism of Bennu Mound, the primordial hill on which Atum first emerged from the waters of chaos. Just as creation began with the rising of the Benben, the priests saw their own inner transformation as a reenactment of the cosmic emergence. They believed that the human spirit could ascend the rays of Ra, not metaphorically, but ritually, following the pathway of sunlight back to its divine source. Through disciplined meditation, purification rites, months of initiatory seclusion, and a carefully guarded liturgy, they trained themselves to dissolve the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. In their worldview, the sun's daily rebirth was a teaching, an invitation to rise inwardly from the darkness of ordinary consciousness into the clarity of divine light. Their central symbol of this ascent was the Bennu bird, the luminous creature associated with the Benben and revered as the soul of Ra. Later remembered by the Greeks as the phoenix, the Bennu was said to appear at Heliopolis each dawn, perched upon the sacred Benben stone, renewing itself in a burst of brilliance. To the priests, this was not a decorative myth, it was an initiatory manual encoded in the story. The Bennu taught that true enlightenment required a controlled burning away of the false self, a spiritual combustion that left only what was eternal. When the texts speak of becoming an Akh, a transfigured being of light, capable of acting in both the earthly realm and the afterlife, they are describing the same transformation that Bennu enacted at the dawn of each day. To rise like the Bennu was to participate directly in the power of creation, to reenact Atum's first emergence, and to step into the solar current that sustained the cosmos. Meanwhile, Heliopolis itself functions as a vast open-air textbook. Its obelisks, towering monoliths carved from single pieces of granite, were engineered to catch the first rays of sunrise, transforming stone into a ritual of pure light. They symbolized the Benben, the primordial mound, and every obelisk stood as a physical expression of the first moment of creation. But here's the real question. Why were these obelisks later hauled across the Mediterranean? Why would Rome, London, Paris, Florence, and New York, cultures separated by thousands of years, fight to possess them? The answer is simple and key to human nature. Stealing an obelisk meant stealing prestige. To take one of these granite sunbeams was to claim Egypt's spiritual authority, its scientific mastery, and its cosmic legitimacy. An obelisk wasn't just an artifact, it was a trophy of the world's oldest theological and astronomical tradition. When emperors and modern governments shipped them home, they were saying, "This power now belongs to us." And the Greeks understood that power long before the Romans had been upon it. Plato visited Heliopolis while studying in Egypt, seeking what he later called the ancestral wisdom of the priests. But he wasn't the only Greek thinker drawn to the city of the sun. Herodotus wrote that Heliopolis was the home of the most learned of the Egyptians, men who preserved precise astronomical records stretching back millennium. He describes its priests as guardians of a wisdom older than Greek memory, men who spoke about the cycles of kings and the rhythm of cosmic renewal. Diodorus Siculus adds that Heliopolis was revered as the birthplace of the gods, and notes that foreign scholars traveled there to be instructed in sacred philosophy. Strabo, the Greek geographer, visited the ruins himself and observed that even in his own day, centuries after its decline, Heliopolis remained a school where priests taught geometry, astronomy, and the allegories of the gods. Plato gave the city fame, but it was part of a long-standing intellectual pilgrimage route. Even in ruin, Heliopolis drew poets, philosophers, and explorers who believed its priests were custodians of a cosmic science lost to the rest of the world. Heliopolis was well known to ancient Jewish scholars. The Hebrew Bible preserves it under the name On, identifying it as the powerful cult center where Joseph, sold into slavery and risen to the right hand of Pharaoh, married Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, a priest of On. Although we are told that this marriage was the result of Joseph's heartfelt desire for Asenath, it also signified Joseph's adoption into Egypt's highest priestly and intellectual elite. His sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were born into a lineage that blended Israelite identity with the solar priesthood of On. To later Jewish interpreters, this union stood as a reminder that the encounter between Israel and Egypt was not merely political, it was deeply theological, connecting the ancestral story of Jacob's house to the oldest religious center in the Nile Valley. Centuries later, Israel's prophets still spoke of Heliopolis as a cultural landmark, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with biting critique. Jeremiah refers to it directly, calling it Beth Shemesh, the house of the sun, and warning that its idols would be shattered. Isaiah speaks of Egypt's cities trembling before judgment and identifies the city of the sun as a place where foundations would be shaken. In some translation, cities of destructions, but in the Hebrew tradition, Ir Haheres, strongly associated with Heliopolis. Ezekiel names it Aven, or Awen, declaring that the young men of Aven shall fall by the sword, using the term as a sharp play on the Hebrew word for idolatry and nothingness. And in a similar tone, Amos warns of judgment upon the people of Aven, situating Heliopolis alongside the great cultic centers of the Near East. These prophets assumed their listeners knew this famous city. Mentioning On or Aven required no explanation. Its reputation reached so far beyond Egypt that it became a shared point of reference in Israel's theological imagination, a symbol of ancient wisdom, foreign power, and spiritual peril all at once. Heliopolis did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It slowly unraveled, beginning around the late 30th dynasty after the reign of Nectanebo I. The archaeological layers show a subtle but unmistakable change. Fewer royal inscriptions, fewer repairs, and no new temple construction after the Persian conquest and the arrival of Alexander the Great. The city entered what scholars now call a phase of reduced maintenance, where monuments eroded, courtyards filled with wind-blown debris, and sacred structures quietly deteriorated. Excavators found industrial workshops operating next to abandoned shrines, signs that parts of the sacred precinct were shifting from ritual use to simple economic survival. Heliopolis was not destroyed outright, rather, it seems to have fallen out of royal favor. The Ptolemies built lavish temples across Egypt, Philae, Edfu, Dendera, but not in Heliopolis. Not a single royal building inscription from the Ptolemaic kings has been found. For a city that had once crowned pharaohs with cosmic authority, this silence was deafening. The priests kept some traditions alive, but without royal patronage, the temple city began its long slide from the spiritual capital of Egypt to only a fading memory. So when did Heliopolis actually turn from Egyptian theology to Greek Hermetic mysticism? The archaeological record points to the late Ptolemaic and early Roman period, about the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, as the time when the city's theological elements increasingly absorbed into Greek intellectual culture. Greek writers, Herodotus, Strabo, Plutarch, and others, visited the site and described its rites, temples, and astronomical knowledge. Strabo, writing in the Augustan age, portrays Heliopolis as still sacred but largely deserted, staffed by elderly priests who explained the ruins to foreign visitors. This was the moment when Egyptian solar theology leaked into Greek esotericism. The teachings of Heliopolis, its doctrines of the Ennead, its meditations on creation, its visions of divine light, were reinterpreted into Greek philosophical traditions. By the 1st century CE, these fused ideas produced what we now call Hermeticism, credited to Hermes Trismegistus. In this way, Heliopolis lived on, not as a temple, but as an idea. The Romans delivered the final blow, though, not out of hatred for the Egyptians, but rather out of fascination. Under Augustus, the first great wave of removal of the obelisk began. At least 2 major obelisks were hauled directly from Heliopolis to Rome, including the Montecitorio obelisk of Psammetichus II and the Flaminian obelisk of Seti I and Ramses II. These granite monoliths required specially constructed ships and enormous engineering feats. Their relocation was not a plunder, it was an appropriation of prestige. Rome wanted to stand where Egypt had stood, to claim the cosmic legitimacy once radiating from the Sun City. Over the next 3 centuries, Heliopolis became a massive stone quarry for Roman Alexandria, for private villas, and for the new imperial cult of Isis and Serapis. Archaeologists have found statues, offering tables, sphinxes, and archaeological blocks from Heliopolis scattered across Pompeii. The last chapters of Heliopolis belong to the Islamic historians who saw only ruins. Ibn Zulach in the 10th century describes two lonely obelisks still standing above a marsh, choked in brambles. Ibn Dukmach in the 4th century speaks of only mounds of debris and notes that every stone had been carried away for construction. The sacred city was gone, absorbed into Cairo's suburbs. And yet, in the Hermetic writings, in the Jewish memory of On, in the Christian Alexandrian traditions, and in the lingering magnetism of its obelisks, Heliopolis continues to radiate its ancient power long after its stones had vanished from the Nile. Well, that wraps this up for this episode. So go ahead, click like, because it helps the channel grow in popularity. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe. It's just a mouse click away.